In the autumn of 1911, ranchers in the remote valleys of eastern Utah began reporting something that defied explanation. It started with livestock found torn apart in ways no known predator could manage. Then came the sightings, a tall, skeletal figure moving across the moonlit ridges with unnatural speed. They called it the Bone Walker, a creature that seemed to follow them, always watching from the tree-line, always just beyond rifle range. Some dismissed it as frontier hysteria. Others swore they heard it breathing outside their cabins at night. By winter, entire families had abandoned their homesteads, leaving behind everything they'd built. What stalked those ranchers in 1911? Was it myth misidentification, or something far stranger lurking in the Utah wilderness? The truth may be more unsettling than any legend. The first report came from a man named Samuel Garrett. He was a cattle rancher, working a spread near the Book Cliffs, a rugged expanse of sandstone plateaus and juniper forests that stretched across the Utah-Colorado border. On the evening of October 3rd, 1911, Garrett was riding back to his homestead when his horse stopped abruptly, ears pinned back, refusing to move forward. Garrett later told the local marshal that the animal was shaking like it had seen the devil himself. Then he saw it. Standing on a ridge about 200 yards away was a figure, tall, impossibly thin, and pale as bone. It didn't move like a man. Its limbs seemed too long, its posture hunched and jerking. Garrett watched it for nearly a minute before it turned and vanished into the scrub oak. He spurred his horse hard and didn't stop until he reached his cabin. He told his wife what he'd seen. She didn't believe him. Not at first, but 3 nights later, they both heard it. A low, rasping sound circling the cabin. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, crunching through the dry October brush. Garrett grabbed his Winchester and stepped outside. The moon was full. The landscape was bathed in silver light. And there, just beyond the fence line, he saw it again, taller than any man. Skeletal, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, watching him. Garrett fired twice. The figure didn't flinch. It simply turned and loped into the darkness with a gait that seemed wrong, too fluid and too broken at the same time. By the end of October, 3 other ranching families in the area reported similar encounters. A homesteader named Elias Thornton found 4 of his cattle mutilated in a dry wash, throats torn out, ribs cracked open, but barely any blood on the ground. Another rancher, a widow named Catherine Pryor, claimed she woke to find handprints on her window. Not human handprints. The fingers were too long, the palms too narrow. The locals began calling it the Bone Walker. No one knew where the name came from. Some said it was because the creature looked like a walking skeleton. Others believed it was tied to old Ute stories, legends of bone collectors, spirits that gathered the remains of the dead and wore them like armor. The Ute people had lived in these lands for centuries before the ranchers arrived, and their oral histories were filled with warnings about creatures that walked between worlds. But the ranchers didn't care about legends. They cared about survival. By mid-November, the sightings had intensified. The Bone Walker was no longer just a figure on a distant ridge. It was coming closer. Ranchers reported finding tracks, long, narrow impressions in the dirt that didn't match any known animal. Some said the tracks appeared and disappeared without a clear trail, as if the creature moved in bursts, vanishing and reappearing elsewhere. Then came the night of November 18th. A young ranch hand named Thomas Birch was checking the livestock when he heard breathing behind him. He turned to find the Bone Walker, standing less than 10 feet away. Birch later described it in a sworn statement to the town marshal. It had skin like old parchment, stretched tight over bones. Its eyes were sunken, black as coal pits. And when it opened its mouth, I saw teeth, too many teeth, sharp as broken glass. Birch ran. He didn't stop until he reached the main house, where he collapsed, hyperventilating and incoherent. The rancher he worked for, a man named Josiah Hale, took a lantern and a shotgun and went out to investigate. He found nothing. No tracks. No sign of disturbance. But the livestock were silent. Every cow, every horse stood completely still, staring in the same direction toward the dark hills. Hale didn't sleep that night. None of them did. Word spread quickly through the small communities scattered across eastern Utah. Some families packed up and left. Others armed themselves and formed night watches, taking turns patrolling their properties with rifles and torches. The local newspaper, the Price Examiner, published a brief article on November 22nd titled, "Strange Sightings Trouble Ranchers." The piece was cautious, almost dismissive, suggesting that the reports were likely exaggerated or the result of wolves or vagrants. But the ranchers knew better. On the night of November 25th, a group of 6 men, led by Samuel Garrett and Josiah Hale, decided to hunt the creature. They tracked it into the foothills, following a trail of broken branches and disturbed soil. Around midnight, they found something that stopped them cold, a clearing scattered with bones. Cattle bones, deer bones, and something else, fragments that looked disturbingly human. They also found symbols. Carved into the trunks of nearby trees were strange markings, circles, spirals, and angular shapes that none of the men recognized. Garrett, who had spent years trading with the Ute, said he'd never seen anything like it. The group debated whether to continue or turn back. Before they could decide, they heard it, a low, guttural growl echoing from somewhere in the darkness. If you want the truth behind this mystery to reach more people, hit like so the investigation goes deeper. They fled. By December, the terror had become unbearable. Families who had lived in the area for generations began abandoning their homesteads. Property values collapsed. The local economy, already fragile, started to crumble. Church meetings turned into desperate prayer sessions. The town marshal, a man named Clayton Reeves, organized a larger search party, but they found nothing, only more tracks, more bones, more symbols. And then, as suddenly as it began, the sighting stopped. By mid-December, no one had seen the bone walker for over a week. The ranchers who remained began to cautiously return to their routines. Some believed the creature had moved on. Others feared it was simply waiting. But the silence held. Winter settled over the Book Cliffs, burying the land in snow and cold. The bone walker had vanished, but the questions remained. What had stalked those ranchers in the autumn of 1911? Where had it come from? And more importantly, where had it gone? To understand the answers, we must go back further into the deep history of the land itself, into the stories that existed long before the ranchers ever arrived. The land the ranchers called home in 1911 was not new. It was ancient. The Book Cliffs, the valleys, the Red Rock Canyons, all of it had been inhabited for thousands of years. The Ute people, the Fremont culture before them, and even earlier indigenous groups had walked these hills, hunted these forests, and left behind stories carved into stone and passed down through generations. And woven into those stories were warnings. Warnings about things that walked alone, things that didn't belong. In Ute oral tradition, there are tales of the Tsawhobbits, bone collectors. These were not animals. They were not spirits in the way Europeans understood spirits. They existed in a liminal space, beings that moved between the physical and the unseen. According to the stories, the Tsawhobbits appeared during times of imbalance, when the natural order had been disrupted, when death had been disrespected, or when sacred sites had been violated. They were described as tall, skeletal, and silent. They followed the living, collecting bones from the dead. Some versions of the story claimed they wore the bones. Others said they consumed them, absorbing the essence of what had been lost. When European settlers arrived in Utah in the mid-1800s, they dismissed these stories as superstition. The land was seen as empty, wild, ready to be claimed and tamed. Ranchers fenced the valleys, miners dug into the mountains, and the Ute were pushed onto reservations. The sacred sites, places of burial, ceremony, and spiritual significance, were often ignored or destroyed. By the early 1900s, the Book Cliffs region was a patchwork of isolated homesteads and cattle ranches. The people who lived there were hard-working, practical, and deeply skeptical of anything they couldn't see or shoot. But the land remembered. In the summer of 1910, a full year before the Bone Walker sightings, a mining crew working near the Green River uncovered something unusual. They were blasting into a hillside when they broke through into a small cave. Inside, they found human remains. Not a burial in the traditional sense, but a collection, dozens of bones arranged in circular patterns, surrounded by symbols painted in red ochre. The miners reported the find to local authorities, But nothing was done. The bones were left where they were. The cave entrance partially collapsed by further blasting. One of the miners, a man named Jacob Reese, later told a journalist that he felt watched for weeks after the discovery. He quit the crew and left Utah shortly after. Then came the autumn of 1911 and the Bone Walker. Common evidence. If you believe this part of the story shouldn't be forgotten, could there be a connection? Some researchers who have studied the 1911 reports believe the disturbance of the burial site may have triggered something, not in a supernatural sense, necessarily, but in a psychological and cultural one. The Ute had long believed that certain places should not be disturbed. If sacred sites were violated, imbalance would follow. But there's another layer to this story, one that involves more than folklore. In the early 1900s, the American Southwest was experiencing a cryptid boom. Newspapers across the region published accounts of strange creatures, giant birds in Texas, lizard men in Arizona, wild men in Colorado. Some of these stories were fabrications designed to sell papers. Others were misidentifications of known animals. But a few remain unexplained. The Bone Walker fits a pattern seen in other cryptid encounters from this era: tall, humanoid, skeletal, and nocturnal. Similar descriptions appear in reports from the San Juan Mountains, the Uinta Basin, and even parts of Nevada. Could these sightings represent a consistent phenomenon, something that predates modern understanding of wildlife and ecology? One theory suggests that the Bone Walker could have been a surviving member of a relic hominid species, something like Gigantopithecus or an unknown primate lineage. Paleontologists have confirmed that large primates once roamed North America during the Pleistocene epoch. Most went extinct around 10,000 years ago, but isolated populations could have survived in remote, rugged terrain. The skeletal appearance described by witnesses might be explained by malnutrition, disease, or seasonal changes in body fat. The unnatural movement could be the result of injury or a unique gait evolved for climbing rocky terrain. The nocturnal behavior would make sense for a creature avoiding human contact. But this theory has problems. First, no physical evidence was ever recovered. No bones, no hair, no definitive tracks that could be studied scientifically. The ranchers were practical people. If they had managed to kill the creature, they would have kept the body. The fact that no remains were ever found suggests that either the Bone Walker was extraordinarily elusive or it was something else entirely. Second, the behavior doesn't match known primate patterns. The Bone Walker didn't seem interested in food. It didn't raid livestock for meat. It mutilated them. It didn't attack humans, even when it had clear opportunities. It watched. It followed. It marked territory with symbols. That last detail is the most troubling. Animals don't carve symbols into trees. Humans do, which raises an even darker possibility. What if the Bone Walker wasn't an animal at all? What if it was a person or multiple people, engaged in a campaign of psychological terror? In 1911, tensions between settlers and indigenous peoples were still high. Land disputes were common. Cultural misunderstandings ran deep. Could the Bone Walker have been a deliberate act of resistance, a way of reclaiming power through fear? Some historians have suggested that the sightings might have been orchestrated by Ute individuals using traditional costumes, masks, and knowledge of the land to drive settlers away from sacred areas. This theory would explain the symbols, the intelligence behind the stalking behavior, and the sudden cessation of sightings. If the goal was to scare settlers off the land, it worked. Multiple families abandoned their homesteads, and the area saw a sharp decline in settlement activity for several years. But the ranchers who witnessed the Bone Walker remained convinced it was not human. They described movement, proportions, and features that didn't align with any costume or disguise. Samuel Garrett, who saw it up close, swore until his death in 1947 that no man could move like that. So where does that leave us? By early 1912, the Bone Walker had become a ghost story. The newspapers stopped covering it. The ranchers who stayed behind rarely spoke of it. The few written accounts that survived were buried in local archives, forgotten for decades. But the land did not forget. Over the years, there have been sporadic reports. Hikers seeing a tall figure in the distance, campers hearing strange breathing sounds at night, hunters finding mutilated animals with no clear predator. None of these reports ever gained traction or consistency of the 1911 sightings, but they persist like an echo that refuses to fade. And in the Ute communities, the stories continue. Elders still speak of the bone collectors, the beings that walk when balance is broken. They do not encourage people to seek them out. They do not invite investigation. They simply warn, some things are meant to remain undisturbed. By late November 1911, fear had turned into action. The ranchers were no longer willing to wait, to watch, to hope the creature would simply leave. Livestock losses were mounting. Sleep was impossible. Families were fracturing under the weight of constant terror. Something had to be done. And so, on the morning of November 28th, a formal hunting party was assembled. Leading the group was Samuel Garrett, the first man to see the bone walker. Alongside him were Josiah Hale, Clayton Reeves, the town marshal, and 7 other armed men, ranchers, miners, and a tracker named William Bill Cutter, a former Army scout with experience hunting in the Southwest. Their plan was simple: track the creature, corner it, and kill it. They started at the clearing where the bones had been found. Bill Cutter studied the ground carefully, his eyes scanning for any disturbance. The tracks they'd seen before were faint, inconsistent. But he found something, a partial print pressed into a patch of damp soil near a fallen log. It was elongated and narrow, with what appeared to be 5 distinct toe marks. Cutter measured it, nearly 14 inches long. No bear, no cat, nothing I've ever tracked, he said quietly. The group followed the trail deeper into the foothills. The terrain grew rougher, loose scree, thick brush, steep drops. The men moved slowly, rifles ready, eyes sweeping the ridgelines. The sun was high, the air crisp and cold. Everything was still, too still. Around midday, they found the second site. It was another clearing, this one larger, surrounded by towering pines. In the center was a structure, if it could be called that. Bones had been arranged into a rough pyramid, stacked deliberately, with a deer skull placed at the top. Around the base were more symbols, carved into stones and scratched into the dirt. The men stood in silence, staring. "This isn't random," Reeves said. "Something's making these." Or someone, Hale muttered. Cutter knelt beside the pyramid, studying the bones. Some were old, bleached white by the sun. Others were fresh, still carrying traces of dried tissue. He picked up a fragment, a rib bone, snapped cleanly in half. The break wasn't jagged like a predator's bite. It was precise, almost deliberate. "Whatever did this is hands," Cutter said. That was when they heard it, a low, distant sound. Not a growl, not a howl. Something between the two, rasping and uneven, like air being forced through a broken windpipe. It came from the trees to the north, echoing through the forest. The men froze, gripping their rifles. The sound came again, closer this time. Type yes if he wants to follow every clue until the very end. Garrett raised his hand, signaling silence. The group spread out, forming a loose perimeter. Cutter moved toward the source of the sound, his rifle raised, his steps careful and quiet. The others followed at a distance, eyes scanning the shadows between the trees. Then the sound stopped. The forest went silent again. No birds, no wind, just a faint crunch of boots on dry leaves. Cutter paused, listening. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing. And then he saw it, movement, high up in the branches of a dead pine about 50 yards ahead. Something was climbing. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, its long limbs gripping the trunk and pulling upward in jerking, insect-like motions. The men could see its outline against the sky, tall, skeletal, pale. It reached the top of the tree and stopped, its head tilting downward, looking directly at them. "Shoot it!" Hale shouted. 3 rifles fired at once. The crack of gunfire echoed through the valley. Bark exploded from the tree. But the figure didn't fall. It launched itself backward, vanishing into the canopy with a speed that seemed impossible. The men ran forward, reaching the base of the tree. There was blood, dark, almost black, smeared across the bark. But there was no body, no sign of where it had gone. Cutter scanned the ground, searching for tracks, for anything. He found a single print pressed deep into the soil. And then nothing. "It's playing with us," Garrett said, his voice tight with frustration. They searched the area for another hour, finding only scattered bones and more symbols. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the men made a decision. They would return to town, resupply, and come back with more men. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't going to be taken down easily. But that night, the Bone Walker followed them home. Samuel Garrett was the first to notice. As the group made their way back to the foothills, he kept glancing over his shoulder. He never saw it directly, but he felt it, a presence, moving parallel to them, staying just out of sight. He mentioned it to Cutter, who nodded grimly. "It's been with us for the last mile," Cutter said, staying in the scrub oak, watching. When they finally reached the outskirts of town, the sensation vanished. But the message was clear. The Bone Walker was aware of them. It knew they were hunting it, and it was hunting them back. Over the next 3 days, the sightings intensified. The creature was no longer content to lurk in the wilderness. It came to the edges of town. Ranchers reported seeing it on rooftops, crouched and motionless. A schoolteacher claimed it stood outside her window for an entire night, staring in. A shopkeeper found tracks circling his store, as if something had been pacing. Studying the building, panic spread. Families who had remained now fled. The town's population dropped by nearly half within a week. The local church held a prayer vigil, with the pastor declaring the creature a demon sent to test the faithful. Others believed it was punishment for the treatment of the Ute, for the desecration of sacred land, for the greed of the settlers. Marshal Reeves tried to maintain order, but even he was shaken. On the night of December 2nd, he woke to the sound of scratching on his door. He grabbed his revolver and yanked the door open. There was nothing there, but on the wooden planks of his porch, carved into the grain, were the symbols they'd seen in the forest. He stared at them for a long time. Then he went back inside, locked the door, and sat by the window with his gun until sunrise. The final hunt was organized on December 5th. This time, the group was larger. 15 men, all armed, all determined to end this. They brought dogs, lanterns, and enough ammunition to fight a small war. Bill Cutter led them back to the bone pyramid, which had grown since they'd last seen it. New bones had been added. Fresh symbols marked the ground. They set up a perimeter and waited. The plan was to lure the creature out, to force it into an ambush. They used cattle carcasses as bait, positioning them in a clearing with clear sight lines. Then they spread out, hidden in the brush, rifles aimed at the kill zone. Hours passed. The sun set. The moon rose, casting pale light across the valley. And then, just after midnight, the Bone Walker appeared. It emerged from the tree lean slowly, its movements deliberate and cautious. In the moonlight, the men could see it clearly for the first time. Its elongated limbs, its hunched posture, the way its skin seemed to hang loose over protruding bones. It approached the bait, its head turning side to side, scanning. Garrett gave the signal. Every rifle opened fire at once. The creature lurched, stumbled, and let out a sound, a high, shrieking wail that split the night. It spun and bolted toward the trees, moving with terrifying speed despite the wounds. The men chased it, crashing through the brush, lanterns swinging wildly. They found blood, lots of it, a trail leading deeper into the hills. But they never found the body. By dawn, the trail had gone cold. The creature had vanished, leaving only bloodstains and broken branches in its wake. The men searched for 2 more days, but found nothing. No bones, no lair, no sign that the Bone Walker had ever existed. And then, as winter settled in, the sighting stopped. Completely. When the dust settled and the Bone Walker faded into silence, the questions began in earnest. What had the ranchers really seen? Was it a creature, a person, a mass delusion, or something else entirely? The lack of physical evidence frustrated investigators then, and it frustrates researchers now. But the absence of proof did not stop theories from proliferating, some rational, some speculative, and some bordering on the bizarre. The first major counter-theory came from Dr. Amos Fletcher, a physician and amateur naturalist based in Salt Lake City. In early 1912, he published an article in the Utah Medical Journal titled Hysteria and the frontier mind. Fletcher argued that the bone walker was not a creature at all, but a case of mass hysteria fueled by isolation, stress, and cultural anxiety. According to Fletcher, the ranchers were living under extreme conditions: economic hardship, harsh weather, social isolation, and the lingering trauma of conflicts with indigenous peoples. In such an environment, he argued, the human mind becomes susceptible to suggestion. One credible sighting, whether real or imagined, could trigger a cascade of similar reports, each reinforcing the other. Fletcher pointed to historical precedents: the Salem witch trials, the mad gas of Mattoon, the phantom airship sightings of the late 1800s. In each case, initial reports created a feedback loop of fear, attention, and confirmation bias. People saw what they expected to see, interpreting ambiguous stimuli, shadows, animal sounds, natural phenomena, as evidence of the threat. The bone pyramids and symbols, Fletcher suggested, could have been the work of opportunists or pranksters, individuals who recognized the panic and exploited it for amusement or profit. The mutilated livestock could be explained by known predators, wolves, cougars, or even feral dogs, whose attacks appeared more sinister in the context of fear. Fletcher's theory was well received in academic circles, but was met with anger and disbelief by the ranchers who had lived through the events. Samuel Garrett, in a letter published in the Price Examiner in March 1912, wrote, "Dr. Fletcher was not there. He did not see what we saw. He did not hear it, smell it, or track it through the hills. To call us hysterics is an insult to men who have faced drought, wolves, and winters that would break most city folk. We know the difference between fear and fact." The debate continued throughout 1912, but it was soon overshadowed by larger events: the approach of World War I, economic troubles, and the slow return of normalcy in eastern Utah. The bone walker became a footnote, a strange chapter in local history. But not everyone forgot. In the 1930s, a journalist named Harold Pitkin became interested in the case while researching frontier folklore. He traveled to Utah, interviewed surviving witnesses, and collected as many first-hand accounts as he could find. What he discovered surprised him. The witnesses, even decades later, remained consistent in their descriptions. They didn't embellish. They didn't contradict each other. And they all insisted the creature was real. Pitkin also uncovered something Fletcher had overlooked: the Ute perspective. Share this video so others know how deep this mystery actually goes. Through an interpreter, Pitkin spoke with several Ute elders who remembered the events of 1911. They did not seem surprised by the ranchers' accounts. In fact, they said the bone walker sightings aligned with their own traditions. One elder, a man named Red Hawk, explained that the bone collectors appeared when sacred ground was violated. They were not evil, he said, but they were not friendly either. They were enforcers of balance, restoring what had been broken. Red Hawk also mentioned something else. The bone walker had been seen before, long before the ranchers arrived. In the 1870s, Ute hunters had encountered a similar figure near burial sites that had been disturbed by miners. In the 1850s, stories circulated about a skeletal being that stalked trappers who had desecrated ceremonial grounds. The pattern was consistent: disturbance, appearance, terror, departure. Pitkin's findings were published in a small regional magazine in 1936, but they never gained mainstream attention. By that time, cryptozoology was not yet a formalized field, and stories like the bone walker were dismissed as folklore rather than serious inquiry. Then came the modern era, and with it, new theories. In the 1970s, during the height of the Bigfoot craze, some cryptozoologists revisited the bone walker case. They theorized that it might represent a different species or subspecies of unknown hominid, something more skeletal, more arboreal, more nocturnal than the typical Sasquatch. The climbing behavior, the long limbs, and elusiveness all fit a model of a tree-dwelling primate adapted to rugged terrain. Others suggested it could be a surviving population of Gigantopithecus, a massive ape that lived in Asia during the Pleistocene. Though no evidence of Gigantopithecus has ever been found in North America, some researchers argue that migration across the Bering Land Bridge during the Ice Age was possible. If true, isolated populations could have survived in remote areas like the Book Cliffs. But these theories face the same problem: no bones, no DNA, no concrete proof. In the 1990s, Paranormal researchers propose a different explanation. They argued that the bone walker was not biological but interdimensional, a being that existed between realities, appearing during moments of spiritual or energetic disruption. The symbols, they claimed, were markers of these dimensional rifts. The creature's sudden appearances and disappearances, the lack of physical evidence, and the eerie consistency of reports across time all suggested something beyond conventional zoology. This theory, while popular in certain circles, is highly speculative and lacks empirical support. Yet it resonates with those who believe the universe contains more mysteries than science currently acknowledges. Then there's the skeptical view. Modern researchers like Dr. Emily Cross, a folklorist at the University of Utah, argue that the bone walker is best understood as a cultural phenomenon, a story that emerged from the collision of indigenous and settler worldviews. The ranchers, she suggests, encountered symbols and rituals they didn't understand, interpreted them to the lens of fear, and created a narrative that gave shape to their anxieties. The creature itself, Cross argues, was likely a misidentification, a malnourished elk, a person in disguise, or even a trick of light and shadow on unfamiliar terrain. The consistency of the reports, she says, is a result of storytelling. People sharing accounts, shaping them, aligning them to fit a communal narrative. But this, too, fails to satisfy those who live through it, because at the core of every theory, rational or otherwise, is an uncomfortable truth. Something happened in the autumn of 1911, something that terrified experienced frontiersmen, something that left behind physical traces, something that defied easy explanation. And the fact that it stopped, suddenly, completely, is perhaps the most unsettling detail of all. Winter came hard to eastern Utah in December 1911. Snow buried the valleys. The wind howled through the canyons. The ranchers who remained hunkered down, their lives reduced to survival, feeding livestock, repairing fences, keeping fires burning. The bone walker sightings had ceased, but the fear lingered like frost on glass. Then, on December 14th, something changed. A young Ute man named Joseph Redfeather arrived in town. He was known to the settlers. He worked occasionally as a guide and translator, moving between the reservation and the ranching communities. But his arrival that day was unusual. He came alone on foot, and he went directly to Marshal Clayton Reeves. What he said was never officially recorded. But according to witnesses who were present, Redfeather told Reeves that the bone walker would not return. He said the disturbance had been corrected, the balance restored. He warned the marshal not to dig further, not to return to the sites in the hills. He said some doors, once opened, should not be examined too closely. Reeves, a pragmatic man, pressed for details. Redfeather refused. He simply repeated his warning, then left. He was never seen in town again. The ranchers debated what to do. Some wanted to ignore Redfeather's words and mount another expedition. Others, exhausted and traumatized, were willing to accept the silence and move on. In the end, practicality won. Winter made further searches nearly impossible, and the absence of new sightings suggested the threat had passed. But curiosity is a persistent thing. In late January 1912, Samuel Garrett and Bill Cutter, against the advice of others, returned to the Bone Pyramid site. They found it buried under snow, the symbols erased by wind and ice. The bones were gone, either scattered by scavengers or removed by someone. The clearing looked almost peaceful, as if nothing had ever happened there. Cutter knelt in the snow, studying the ground. He found no tracks, no disturbances. Just silence. Do you think Redfeather was telling the truth? Garrett asked. Cutter didn't answer right away. He stood slowly, his eyes scanning the tree-line. I think something was here. And I think something decided to leave. Why? That's the question I can't answer. They rode back to town. Neither of them spoke much. And when they arrived, they agreed not to discuss what they'd seen or hadn't seen. The chapter, they decided, was closed. But closure is not the same as resolution. If this detail surprised you, comment unexplained below. Over the following months, life in the Book Cliffs region slowly returned to normal. Families who had fled began to drift back, drawn by cheap land and economic necessity. The abandoned homesteads were reclaimed. The livestock industry recovered. The newspapers stopped running stories about the creature. The Bone Walker faded into local legend, but not completely. In private journals, in letters between family members, in quiet conversations around hearths, the story persisted. Garrett, Hale, Cutter, and the others who had witnessed the events rarely spoke of them publicly, but they never recanted. To their dying days, they maintained that something real, something unexplainable, had stalked them in the autumn of 1911, and there were hints, small, strange hints, that the story was entirely over. In 1915, a hunter named Carl Jennings reported finding a bone structure similar to pyramids while tracking deer in the Uinta Basin, about 80 miles north of the original sightings. He dismantled it, spooked by the symbols, and never returned to the area. In 1923, a shepherd grazing his flock in the Book Cliffs claimed he saw a tall, pale figure watching him from a ridge at dusk. He didn't approach. He left the area immediately and never grazed there again. In 1931, during the Great Depression, a family traveling through eastern Utah on their way to California stopped to camp near the Green River. Their daughter, a girl of 7, told her parents she saw a bone man standing at the edge of the firelight. The parents saw nothing, but they packed up and left that night. These incidents were isolated, never investigated, never confirmed, but they exist in the historical record. Faint echoes of something that refuses to be forgotten. So, what happened in December 1911? What caused the sightings to stop? One possibility is that the creature, whatever it was mortally wounded during the final hunt. The blood trail, the sudden cessation of activity, and the absence of further sightings all support this. If it was a flesh and blood animal, it may have crawled into a remote den and died. Its body never recovered. Another possibility is that it moved on. If the Bone Walker was territorial, it might have decided the area was too dangerous, too heavily patrolled, and relocated to another part of the wilderness. This would explain the sporadic sightings in later years, a creature moving through the region, appearing briefly, then vanishing again. A third possibility, the one Joseph Redfeather seemed to suggest, is that the disturbance was ritual in nature. If the bone pyramids and symbols were part of a spiritual practice, either indigenous or something else, the completion of that practice might have ended the manifestations. The Bone Walker, in this view, was not a creature at all, but a phenomenon tied to specific conditions that were resolved by the winter of 1911. And then there's the fourth possibility, the one no one wants to say out loud, that it's still there, waiting, watching, dormant but not gone. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The wilderness of eastern Utah is vast. Thousands of square miles of rugged, uninhabited land. Deep canyons, hidden caves, endless forest. If something wanted to hide there, it could, easily. And if it wanted to return, it could do that too. The Bone Walker case is a study in ambiguity. It sits at the intersection of folklore, cryptozoology, psychology, and indigenous history. No single explanation fully accounts for all the evidence. Each theory illuminates one aspect, while leaving others in shadow. And perhaps that's the point. Perhaps the Bone Walker is meant to resist easy categorization, to linger in the space between the known and the unknown. Let's examine what we actually know. First, the witnesses were credible. These were not imaginative teenagers or publicity-seeking opportunists. They were working ranchers, lawmen, and frontiersmen, people whose survival depended on clear judgment and accurate observation. Their accounts were consistent, detailed, and reported independently. They described the same physical features, the same behaviors, the same locations. That consistency is difficult to dismiss. Second, there was physical evidence. The bone pyramids, the symbols, the mutilated livestock, the tracks, all of these were documented by multiple witnesses. While none of this evidence was preserved or scientifically analyzed, its existence is attested in contemporary reports. Something left those marks. Whether that something was a creature, a person, or a group remains unclear. Third, the cultural context is crucial. The Ute people have lived in the region for centuries, and their traditions include stories of bone collectors and spiritual enforcers. These stories predate the 1911 sightings by generations. The fact that the ranchers' descriptions align with indigenous accounts suggests either a shared encounter with a real phenomenon or a cultural transmission of symbolic imagery. Fourth, the timing is significant. The sightings began shortly after the disturbance of a burial site by miners in 1910. They intensified in the autumn of 1911 and ceased abruptly in December that year. This pattern suggests a triggering event and a resolution, consistent with both biological and ritual interpretations. So what are we left with? If the bone walker was a biological creature, it was unlike anything currently recognized by science. Its morphology, tall, skeletal, long-limbed, does not match any known North American mammal. Its behavior, intelligent, territorial, ritualistic, suggests cognitive complexity beyond typical predators. Its elusiveness and the lack of remains suggest either extreme rarity or adaptations that make recovery of evidence nearly impossible. If it was a person or a group of people, the question becomes, why? What motive would drive someone to engage in such elaborate, sustained, and dangerous deception? The effort required to create the bone structures, carve the symbols, stalk the ranchers, and maintain the illusion over months is staggering. And for what gain? To drive settlers off the land? To protect sacred sites? To enact revenge? These motives are plausible, but they require assuming a level of coordination and secrecy that seems unlikely given the small, tight-knit communities involved. If it was a psychological phenomenon, mass hysteria, or misidentification, then we must explain the consistency of reports, the physical traces, and the testimony of experienced trackers like Bill Cutter. Fear can distort perception, but it cannot create tracks in the dirt or arrange bones into pyramids. And if it was something paranormal or interdimensional, we leave the realm of evidence-based inquiry and enter speculation. This explanation is unfalsifiable and therefore unsatisfying to those who seek empirical answers. Like, if you want more unsolved history, comment your theory and subscribe so you don't miss the next investigation. But perhaps the bone walker is not meant to be solved. Perhaps its value lies not in the answer, but in the question. It forces us to confront the limits of our knowledge. It reminds us that the world, even in the modern age, contains pockets of mystery. It challenges the assumption that everything can be explained, categorized, and controlled. The ranchers of 1911 lived on the edge of the known world. They inhabited a landscape that was neither fully settled nor fully wild, a transitional space where the old ways and the new collided. In that liminal zone, strange things happened, things that defied the rational frameworks being imposed by industrialization, science, and expansion. The bone walker, in this sense, is more than a cryptid. It is a symbol, a manifestation of the tension between progress and preservation, between conquest and respect, between knowing and mystery. And it asks a question that remains relevant today. What happens when we disturb what should be left alone? The miners who broke into the burial cave did so in pursuit of profit, with no regard for the sanctity of the site. The ranchers who settled the land did so with little understanding of its history or significance. These are not moral judgments. They are observations about the collision of cultures and worldviews. The Ute believed the land had memory. They believed that certain places held power, that disruption brought consequences. The settlers believed the land was empty, waiting to be claimed. Two incompatible philosophies, existing in the same space, each shaping the other. The bone walker, whether real or imagined, emerged from that collision. It was the land speaking back. It was the past refusing to be buried. It was the unknown asserting itself against the certainty of maps and fences. And when it vanished, it left behind a question that lingers to this day. Are we alone in the wilderness? Or is there something else, something older, something patient, watching from the ridgelines and waiting for the next disturbance? The story of the bone walker does not end in 1911. It ripples forward through time, surfacing in unexpected places, weaving itself into the fabric of regional folklore and modern cryptozoology. The creature has become a ghost that haunts not just the hills of Utah, but the collective imagination of those who seek the unexplained. In the 1940s, during World War II, a soldier from eastern Utah named Daniel Moss wrote a letter home to his brother. In it, he mentioned the bone walker, how his grandfather had seen it, how the story still unsettled him, even in the face of combat. "I've seen men die," he wrote, "but I've never felt fear like my grandfather described." He said it wasn't fear of death. It was fear of something wrong, something that shouldn't exist. In the 1950s, a schoolteacher in Price, Utah, assigned her students a local history project. Several chose to research the bone walker. They interviewed elderly residents, many of whom remember the events of 1911 secondhand, passed down from parents or grandparents. The students compiled their findings into a small booklet titled Legends of the Book Cliffs. It was never published widely, but copies circulated among families, keeping the story alive. In the 1970s, as Bigfoot fever swept the nation, the bone walker caught the attention of cryptozoologists. A researcher named Dr. Martin Cross traveled to Utah to investigate. He combed through newspaper archives, interviewed descendants of the original witnesses, and hiked the areas where the sightings occurred. He found no new evidence, but he was struck by the consistency of the accounts. This wasn't a hoax, he concluded. Something happened. Whether it was a creature, a cultural event, or a psychological phenomenon, I can't say, but it was real to those who experienced it. Cross's report was published in a cryptozoology journal in 1978, introducing the bone walker to a wider audience. It became a footnote in the larger Bigfoot narrative, a strange cousin to more famous hairy giants of the Pacific Northwest. But the most haunting echoes came from the land itself. In 1983, a group of hikers exploring the Book Cliffs stumbled upon a cave they'd never seen marked on any map. Inside, they found bones, animal and possibly human, arranged in circular patterns. They also found symbols carved into the stone walls, weathered and ancient. The hikers photographed the site and reported it to local authorities, but by the time anyone returned to investigate, the cave entrance had collapsed, either naturally or deliberately. In 1995, a wildlife biologist conducting a survey in Uinta Basin reported an unusual encounter. While setting camera traps, he heard movement in the trees above him. He looked up to see a figure, tall, pale, moving to the branches with unsettling fluidity. He watched it for several seconds before it vanished into the canopy. He did not report it officially, fearing ridicule, but he mentioned it years later in an interview with a paranormal podcast. In 2003, a family camping near the Green River woke to find symbols carved into a tree at the edge of their campsite. The symbols matched descriptions from the 1911 accounts: circles, spirals, angular lines. They packed up immediately and left. When they reported it to park rangers, no explanation was offered. And in 2011, exactly 100 years after the original sightings, a hiker named Sarah Colton claimed she saw the bone walker. She was backpacking alone in the Book Cliffs when she noticed something moving parallel to her trail. At first, she thought it was a deer. Then she saw it stand upright. She described it as impossibly tall, skeletal, and pale. It watched her for several minutes, then turned and disappeared into the forest. Colton reported the sighting online, where it was met with skepticism and fascination in equal measure. These modern accounts are fragmentary, unverified, and easily dismissed, but they exist. They add layers to a story that refuses to die, and they raise an unsettling possibility that the bone walker was never unique to 1911, that it has always been there, appearing and disappearing according to rhythms we don't understand. So, what do we make of this? Perhaps the bone walker is a cryptid, in the traditional sense, a rare, undiscovered species that inhabits remote wilderness and avoids human contact. If so, the lack of physical evidence is frustrating, but not unprecedented. Many animals evade detection for years, even in well-studied regions. The wilderness of Utah is vast and rugged enough to conceal something large and elusive. Perhaps it is a cultural phenomenon, a story that takes on life through repetition, belief, and the power of suggestion. People see what they expect to see. A strange shadow becomes a creature. A misidentified animal becomes a legend. The story feeds on itself, growing with each retelling. Perhaps it is something else. Something that exists in the margins of reality, appearing when certain conditions align, environmental, spiritual, or psychological. The indigenous traditions speak of such things, beings that walk between worlds, visible only to those who are attuned or vulnerable. Or perhaps it is all of these things at once. Perhaps the bone walker is real and symbolic, biological and mythic, creature and story intertwine in ways that defy simple categorization. What we know for certain is this: the land remembers, the stories endure, and the mystery remains open. The book cliffs still rise against the sky, red rock and pine forests, canyons carved by ancient rivers. The wind still moves through the valleys, carrying sound that might be animal, might be wind, might be something else. And somewhere, in the deep places where humans rarely venture, there are bones, arranged in patterns, marked with symbols, waiting to be found, or waiting to find us. Because the most unsettling aspect of the Bone Walker legend is not the question of what it was. It's the question of what it wanted. The creature did not kill. It did not consume. It watched. It followed. It marked territory. It seemed to communicate, in its own way, a message the ranchers could feel but not understand. Was it warning them? Judging them? Testing them? We will likely never know. But the story endures because it touches something primal in us. The fear of being watched by something we cannot see, the knowledge that we are not the apex presence in the wild, the suspicion that the world contains layers of reality we have not yet mapped. The Bone Walker is a reminder, a symbol, a question mark carved into the wilderness. And as long as there are dark forests, deep canyons, and places where the light does not reach, there will be stories like this. Stories that refuse to be solved. Stories that live in the space between the known and the unknown. Stories that walk. There is a peculiar weight to silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something held back, something unspoken. The ranchers of 1911 carried that silence for the rest of their lives. They returned to their routines, rebuilt their livelihoods, raised families, and grew old. But the silence never left them. Samuel Garrett, the first to see the Bone Walker, lived until 1947. In his later years, he became a respected elder in the community, known for his quiet demeanor and careful words. He rarely spoke of the events of 1911, but when he did, his tone was measured, almost reverent. There are things in this world we're not meant to understand, he said in an interview shortly before his death. And maybe that's the best. Josiah Hale, the rancher who led many of the hunts, died in 1952. His grandson later recalled that Hale kept a journal, a leather-bound book filled with sketches and notes from his life. On the last page, written in shaky handwriting near the end of his life, were the words, "I saw it. I know what I saw. Let that be enough." Bill Cutter, the tracker, left Utah in 1915 and never returned. He moved to Wyoming, worked as a guide, and eventually settled in Montana. In a letter to a friend in 1938, he wrote, "There are tracks you follow and tracks you leave alone. I learned that in Utah, some trails lead nowhere good." These men and others like them carried the memory of the Bone Walker as a burden, not because they feared ridicule. They were too old, too established to care about that, but because the experience had fundamentally changed how they saw the world. They had glimpsed something that didn't fit, something that broke the rules of the reality they'd built their lives upon. And once you've seen that, you can't unsee it. The silence extended beyond the witnesses. The town of Price, the surrounding communities, even the broader region, everyone seemed to agree, without saying it explicitly, that the Bone Walker was better left in the past. The newspapers stopped covering it. The local historians barely mentioned it. The story became a whisper, passed in private, never shouted. Why? Part of it was practical. The events of 1911 had caused real damage, economic disruption, population loss, trauma. Revisiting it served no purpose. Moving on, rebuilding, forgetting that was survival. But part of it was something deeper. A collective intuition that some stories, once told too loudly, invite consequences. The Ute had always believed this. They did not speak openly of certain beings, certain places. To name them was to call them. To discuss them was to risk their return. And perhaps, on some level, the ranchers came to believe it too. The modern world has no patience for such silence. We investigate. We excavate. We demand answers. Every mystery is a puzzle to be solved. Every unknown a gap to be filled. But the Bone Walker resists this. It remains elusive, not just physically, but conceptually. It slips through the nets of explanation, leaving only fragments. And maybe that's the point, because the Bone Walker is not just a story about a creature. It's a story about limits. The limits of knowledge, the limits of control, the limits of our dominion over the natural world. It reminds us that no matter how much we map, measure, and categorize, there are still places, physical and metaphysical, that remain beyond our reach. The wilderness is not empty. It never was. It is filled with histories we do not know, languages we do not speak, presences we do not see. The bone walker, whether real or imagined, is a voice from that wilderness. It speaks in symbols and silence, in tracks that vanish in bones that arrange themselves. It speaks in the fear of ranchers, the warnings of elders, the unease that settles over a forest at dusk. And it speaks in the question it leaves behind. What happens when we forget how to listen? The settlers of 1911 were builders. They carved farms from a wilderness, raised families in harsh terrain, and believed they were taming the land. But the land was never theirs to tame. It belonged to itself, to the forces that shaped it over millennia, to the beings human and otherwise, who had walked it long before wagons and fences arrived. The bone walker was a reminder of that, a disruption, a refusal, and when it left, it did not leave because it was defeated. It left because the message had been delivered. The question is, did anyone understand it? We arrive now at the end. Now the story has no end, but of this telling. The bone walker of Utah remains unsolved. No bones were ever found. No definitive photograph was ever taken. No scientific expedition ever confirmed its existence. And yet it endures in the archives of small-town newspapers, in the memories of descendants, in the campfire stories told by hikers who passed through the Book Cliffs, in the whispers of those who still walk the old trails and feel, just for a moment, that they are not alone. So what are we to make of it? If you are a skeptic, you might conclude that the bone walker was a misidentification amplified by fear, a confluence of wolves, malnutrition, and cultural anxiety that create a phantom where none existed. You might point to the lack of physical evidence, the psychological pressures of frontier life, and the well-documented tendency of humans to pattern-match threats and ambiguous stimuli. And you would not be wrong to do so. This is a valid interpretation, grounded in reason and evidence. If you are a believer, you might see the bone walker as proof that the world contains mysteries science has yet to acknowledge. A creature unknown to zoology, surviving in the margins, appearing only when conditions align. You might point to consistency of the reports, the credibility of the witnesses, and the alignment with indigenous traditions. And you would not be wrong to do so. This, too, is a valid interpretation, grounded in testimony and cultural knowledge. If you are somewhere in between, you might conclude that the truth is layered, that the bone walker was real in some form, but not in the way we typically define reality, that it was a phenomenon, biological, psychological, cultural, spiritual, that cannot be reduced to a single explanation, and you would not be wrong to do so. This is perhaps the most honest interpretation, acknowledging complexity without demanding closure. The beauty of the bone walker story is that it allows for all of these interpretations. It does not force you to choose. It invites you to sit with uncertainty, to hold multiple possibilities at once, to accept that some questions do not have answers. And perhaps that is a lesson. We live in an age that prizes certainty. We want our mysteries solved, our questions answered, our fears named and neutralized. But the world does not always cooperate. There are still places where the unknown lingers. There are still stories that resist resolution. There are still silences that speak louder than words. The bone walker is one of those silences. It walked the ridges of eastern Utah in the autumn of 1911, terrifying ranchers and defying explanation. It left behind bones and symbols, tracks and blood, fear and wonder. And then it vanished, leaving only questions. Where did it come from? What did it want? Was it flesh and blood, or something else? Will it return? We do not know, and perhaps we are not meant to. But the questions themselves are valuable. They remind us that the world is stranger than we imagine. They humble our certainty. They open doors we thought were closed. And they keep us searching. Because the urge to investigate, to understand, to explore, that is what makes us human. It is what drove the ranchers to hunt the creature, the journalists to document it, the researchers to study it. It is what drives us, even now. to revisit the story, to turn it over in our minds, to wonder. The bone walker may be gone, or it may be waiting. Either way, the mystery endures. And as long as there are forests to walk, canyons to explore, and ridges to climb, there will be those who feel it. The presence, the watching, the sense that something old and patient still moves through the wilderness, leaving signs for those willing to see. So we return to the beginning, to Samuel Garrett, riding home on an October evening in 1911, to the figure on the ridge, pale and skeletal, watching, to the moment when the known world cracked open, just enough to let something else slip through. And we ask, what was it? The answer is silence. The answer is mystery. The answer is a question itself, echoing across more than a century, still waiting to be heard. If you want the truth behind this mystery to reach more people, if you believe this story should not be forgotten, if you think we should follow every clue until the very end, then share it, discuss it, keep it alive. Because the Bone Walker is not just a creature from 1911. It is a reminder that the world is vast, strange, and full of wonders we have yet to name. And somewhere, in the deep places where the light does not reach, it is still walking,